Please take your seats. Thank you. Thank you. So when we came up with the title Chaos, we looked for our all-star team, and here it is. Niall Ferguson, as you no doubt heard yesterday, is a renowned historian and public intellectual. His most recent of many wonderful books is actually perfect for this occasion. It's called Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe. David Miliband is the longtime president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, one of the world's great NGOs, and it does its great work in 40 different countries around the world. And honestly, for many of us, if we had our druthers, he would now be the Prime Minister of Britain. But that aside, and CLARISSA WARD is Chief International Correspondent for CNN, and over 20 years she has reported bravely and brilliantly from all of the worst war zones you can imagine, from Sudan to Syria to Yemen and to Ukraine and Afghanistan. And together they're going to be in conversation with Jeffrey Goldberg, who you know as the editor-in-chief of the great magazine, The Atlantic. Here they are. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all very, very much. Mr. Prime Minister, it's a really lovely of you to join. I didn't realize that Sun Valley had turned against Starmer, so
we've got a great Prime Minister now.
I just was saying to Neil, 3 weeks from now, Rishi Sunak's probably going to be moving to Sun Valley, right? So that's like British political humor, sorry. So thank you all for coming. We're going to talk about every single thing. Apparently in 55 minutes.
Is that you or the...
Yeah, that's yours.
That's fine.
First, we're going to settle the distribution of water resources on the stage, which is one of those issues that you always want to talk about on panels. So I think we have to talk about the world and its chaos, its level of chaos, in the context of this upcoming presidential race. For purposes of clarity or purposes of simplicity, let's assume that Kamala Harris is the nominee until proven otherwise. She doesn't have it yet, obviously, but it seems likely. That was not a call for applause, but sure. And I want to maybe hear all three of you briefly. To the extent that you could understand or imagine what a Trump foreign policy, Trump 2.0 foreign policy would look like in particular areas. I'm thinking obviously Ukraine, Russia, Taiwan, China, Middle East. Talk about what you understand the world would look like in a Trump presidency, and what the world might look like with a Harris presidency right now. I mean, Sun Valley is not the only place where people are, frenetically studying Kamala Harris right now. They're doing it in Beijing and Moscow and Tehran and everywhere else. So, Neil, maybe we'll just start with you.
Well, I'm about to make myself even less popular than I was yesterday. I think most people who consume, let's just say, liberal media have a wrong idea about what a second Trump presidency would be like. And they also have a wrong idea about what the Biden-Harris administration has been like. And so I'm going to say unpopular things, and then you can be popular, David, by disagreeing with me.
Don't just encourage him.
The problem with fairness. The problem with the Biden administration is that there has been one failure of deterrence after another.
No, come on. Let's not do that.
I don't mind heckling because I'm from Glasgow and it inspires me to shatter your illusions, which need
You're
to
about
be
to get
shattered.
filibustered, so please
Just
let him
bear
just
in
talk.
mind that whatever you may think about the Trump administration, no major wars, indeed no wars, broke out under Donald Trump's first administration. Joe Biden's failure to manage the exit from Afghanistan competently encouraged Putin to feel that there really would be no downside to invading Ukraine. I wrote in 2021 that Biden was failing to deter Putin, so this is not the benefit of hindsight. They took the sanctions off Nord Stream 2, they reduced arms shipments to Ukraine, and they said that only sanctions would ensue if there was any further Russian military action. The war was predictable. Indeed, it was the first thing I wrote in my Bloomberg column the first week of January 2022. And it didn't stop there because the Biden administration also failed to deter Iran from unleashing its proxies against Israel in October last year. That's the record. You may not want to hear this, Mr. Boo, but I'm here to tell you that this administration's foreign policy track record is a bad one. And they're not done. I don't know whether the president is not done, but they're not done. And we still have a Taiwan crisis that we could experience. If not this year, at some point in the next few years, it is clear that there will be a showdown over Taiwan. And once again, the United States is not deterring China. We do not have a credible deterrent in place to stop China imposing a blockade on Taiwan. They could do it this afternoon, and we would not have a good response. That's the problem. On the other side, if one looks at what Donald Trump has said, and remember, we should have learned by now to take him literally and seriously. If we haven't learned that, we've learned nothing. Listen to what he has said. Read the Bloomberg interview. If you haven't read it, you're not doing your homework. And what is interesting is that he and Vance explicitly call themselves and use the language of realism. They say they will end the war in Ukraine. They say they will deter Iran and indeed impose greater pressures on Iran. And crucially, they and all the other people talking about US foreign policy on the Republican side say that they will deter China. That's the very fundamental difference. This administration has used the word de-escalation to excess. I want to try and convince you that de-escalation is the functional opposite of deterrence. And what the United States needs is an administration that can deter the axis of ill will, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. That's the reality of the choice that you face and I face as an American voter. And I just hope that you have the clarity of vision to make the right choice.
So I'm not an American voter, and the bad news for those of you who booed Neil is that I'm afraid the 24th of February 2022 was a failure of deterrence. It was a failure of deterrence, though, for a slightly different reason than Neil has pointed out. Pretty much all of the things that have happened since the 24th of February 2022, the entry of Sweden and Finland into NATO, the European Union playing a role in shipping arms to the Ukrainians, first time in its history that's ever done that, still has Ireland as a neutral country doing that. The raising of defence spending actually has started about 10 years ago, but has been accelerated, and above all, the 100 billion euros that Germany has committed in its so-called Zeitenwende, a new era, the attacks on the Russian economy. None of those things were put on the agenda before the 24th of February 2022. And they weren't put on the agenda because, first of all, the Ukrainians were saying, no, there's not going to be an invasion. I went to the Munich Security Conference, which was a week before the invasion, and the Ukrainians were there saying, no, this invasion isn't going to happen. And I'm afraid a lot of the Europeans, although not the Brits, didn't believe it was going to happen either. So I do think we have to take seriously that we didn't believe our own rhetoric about the defense of Ukraine, and that undoubtedly played into the Russian mentality, which was that there was an easy win. almost a repeat of Czechoslovakia in 1968 or Hungary in 1956, that there'd be some kind of change of regime in Kyiv. So I think this point about deterrence is very, very important. And it's important because two big things are happening in geopolitics today. One is the fragmentation of political power. One reason we may get onto this, I'm not with Neil about Cold War II, is that actually I think we have a much more fragmented global landscape, where there are not just two big superpowers, but you have the Turkeys, the Indonesias, the Indias, the Brazils of this world, never mind the Saudi Arabias and the United Arab Emirates, playing pretty major roles in conflicts around the world. And they're not, whenever China or America click their fingers, they don't get the response that they used to get. So one big thing that's going on is the fragmentation of political power. That would be difficult enough on its own. The second big thing that's going on is the rise of global risks. Those are risks around pandemics, those are risks around nuclear, those are risks around climate, which is a security risk as well as an environmental risk. And these global risks are interacting with the fragmentation of political power in a very unhealthy way. I would say the risks are being exacerbated by the fragmentation of power is being exacerbated by the risks. And so what the next American administration faces is this very, very challenging global landscape, where on the one hand, I do think deterrence has got to be a central part of this. I mean, the whole point of having weapons is not to use them, but to avoid using them. But there's got to be more of it than that. And I was at the Aspen Security Conference on last week. And
we don't mention Aspen.
Okay,
You're
but
Where is that?
global adversaries.
And there was a question to Condoleezza Rice that she answered in an artful way. It was a question about the potential second Trump administration. And she said, the four horsemen of the apocalypse that I see are nativism, nationalism, protectionism, and isolationism. And she didn't say that's what a Trump second term would represent, but she was telling a story about the dangers for American interest in this interdependent world. And there's no doubt that there are different strands of thought in the putative second Trump administration. They're not all isolationists, but speaking as a European, I live in New York, but work in New York, but I'm obviously, you can tell by my accent, I'm a European. Europeans are terrified.
A former European.
No, still a European. I'm a British, but I can still be European because I can still think Brexit was a terrible
We're not going to do that debate now.
We're not going to do that debate.
We're just not. We're not doing
it.
No, we're not doing it.
Just let me just understand the degree of fear that exists in Europe, that the next 10, 20, 30 years are not going to be spent debating Ukraine, they're going to be spent debating Russia. Because no one in Europe thinks that Ukraine is the end of it. If the Ukraine war was to end tomorrow, it's not going to end the Russia question, which is fundamental to Europe.
Let me frame this out for Clarissa a little bit. You cover every world conflict in your peripatetic career. And I want to ask you about the state of American deterrence. On the one hand, in the Biden administration, we see that that we have not, the world's greatest superpower has not figured out how to put the Houthis in a box, right? That month after month after month, they're firing missiles at shipping, they're firing missiles at Israel, and we can't figure, they're not apparently very scared of the United States. On the other hand, you have Donald Trump saying in an interview, in that Bloomberg interview, saying that, you know, I can't understand why we would defend Taiwan. They're 86 miles or whatever from China. We're 6,500 miles away. Anyway, they don't pay us, which is, sort of the mercantile understanding. That signals certain things to Beijing. It doesn't seem like these are the salad days for the power of American deterrence. Give us your view of that. And also get them to agree with each other somehow. Okay.
Can I start with a story about the Houthis? Because you mentioned them. I just think it'll give you
Who among us doesn't start with stories about the Houthis? Yes.
I sat down in Sana'a with the Houthi leadership in 2014, and the Saudis were bombing the city heavily, and I was extremely nervous. And we did the interview very quickly, and at the end of it, the Houthi leader said to me, "I would love for you to stay for lunch." And I said, "That is so kind of you, thank you, but it's not safe here, and we're going to leave now." And he said, "Yes, of course, I understand. You will stay for lunch."
Yeah.
And I stayed for lunch. I'm not kidding you. He hand-fed me a dish called salta, and the only thing I was able to do was just intervene before it got to my mouth so I could do the final furlong. And at the end of it, he said, enti hudhud, which means you are hudhud, the winged messenger that appears in the Quran. My point to tell this anecdote is to make it very clear that the Houthis do not care at all what kind of messaging is being telegraphed from whichever administration in Washington. Their motivations are completely different. They are largely directed at this stage by Tehran. And everybody in the world can see very clearly that America, and this is not a bipartisan issue, is twisting itself into pretzels with its political caprices and with all the challenges that we see playing out in terms of the democratic processes and how that is impacting America's ability to exert real, meaningful will on the international community. Everybody understands internationally that 2 years into a presidency, campaigning starts for the next round, for the midterms, then the next election. And so there's a limitation in terms of what America can realistically achieve with deterrence. Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, is sitting there in Russia being like, I got nothing but time. I got nothing but time. I don't have to answer to my constituents. I can do what I want, and I know how capricious the American political system is. I know that people will get tired, that people will start grumbling about how much money and how much energy has been poured into Ukraine, and that people's attention will be distracted so quickly. And I know that my people will shut up and put up with it for as long as it takes. And so the question you have to ask yourself, I guess, in that position is, how can America, in an agile and nimble way, adapt to that kind of a challenge when it's permanently in election mode?
Right. Neil, do you agree that,
Well,
that the kind of capricious, bipolar nature of our foreign policy making work is a structural problem against deterrence?
well, first, I'm glad that we have democracy, and I would not like to have Russia's time-consistent political system, and I think it's not a new problem. What's striking to me, though, is that if one looks back over our lifetimes, the extent to which, on key issues, there has in fact been bipartisanship. And right now, there's a bipartisan consensus that China is a major issue. One of the more extraordinary things that Mr. Boo won't like me saying is that Donald Trump radically altered American policy towards China. And the Democrats essentially followed his lead and have changed almost nothing about the Trump administration's China policy, which was tariffs and technological containment. In the Middle East, though, there was a major change, and it was a big mistake. And that change was to try to resuscitate the already dead Iran nuclear agreement. And I think in being a good deal more accommodating of Iran than Trump had been, they emboldened Tehran to unleash its proxies, not only the Houthis, but also Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and of course Hamas, and of course Hezbollah. And I think the Middle East policy was a mistake because, in fact, the Trump administration's policy, which produced the Abraham Accords, was actually working quite well. Iran was isolated, and the Arabs and Israelis were converging in a series of agreements.
To be fair, it wasn't the Iran nuclear deal wasn't dead; it had been killed by Trump, and it had its weaknesses, but it had been well. David, you
my point is that trying to revive it, regardless of whether you thought it was viable before Trump was elected, I didn't think it was, and nor did Kissinger. But trying to revive it in 2021 was doomed to fail. And there were people in the Biden administration who knew that, but they had to go along with it because it was part of what they decided to do. So I think it's not that we're always inconsistent, and it's not that American foreign policy changes every time the party in the White House changes. Think of how consistent the US was in the Cold War. Republicans and Democrats broadly agreed in the 50s and 60s that you had to contain the Soviet Union, and then they came to agree that Vietnam had been a terrible mistake. I'm struck by how much consensus there is between what you might call Republican-Democratic establishments. The debates on American foreign policy go on within the parties. That's true today. Just to go to something that you said, David, the isolationists are a faction within the Republican Party. they have lost out heavily in the past year. I think they started to lose the minute Tucker Carlson did his preposterous interview with Putin. And at this point, the isolationists are not really dominant. In the case of the Democrats, the progressives think that Biden was too nice to Israel, and the establishment think he wasn't tough enough. So I think the real divisions on American foreign policy are within the parties more than they are between them.
All right. David, you want to jump in on the Iran question?
As always with Neil, he covers a lot of ground in a very short space of time. The point I would make is that it's not only America that has domestic politics that affects foreign policy. Dictatorships have domestic politics as well, and Iran is a very, very good example of that. I spent 3 years trying to negotiate with the Iranians. We had diplomatic relations with the Iranians between 2007 and 2010. We were trying to negotiate a deal. What I would say to Neil is that in 2016, the length of time to nuclear breakout had already surpassed 1 year and was going up to 18 months and heading much further as a result of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Where we are today is of a nuclear program that is within 6 to 8 weeks of breakout.
Anthony Blinken says it's less than that.
Even less than that, so you make my point for me. The point...
No, but that's actually, after 3.5 years of the Biden administration,
well,
just to be clear.
Well, what happened was that the Iranian domestic politics, which was always biased against a side that said it's worth negotiating with the West. Because remember, ultimate power lies with the supreme leader. There's only been 2 supreme leaders since the revolution of 1979. The faction that argued for engagement finally got its way internally in 2015 for the major concessions that were made, the concrete that was poured into the centrifuges. And within a year and a half, they were proven, quote-unquote proven, to be naive because the agreement that they'd been signed, that had been agreed at the UN Security Council as well as between the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, was thrown in the bin. And it was thrown in the bin by a unilateral action in under the Trump administration. Now, you said Iran was isolated. Actually, what was going on during the Trump administration was not a Cold War, but a pretty hot war between the Saudis and the Qataris. You had a whole manner of different splits. That speaks to this geopolitical fragmentation. I think what we have to understand, that there's a tempting view that we're living in a quote-unquote multipolar world. In other words, that there's 6 or 7 different poles of political power, and that they are held in some kind of balance. What frightens me today is not that there's a multipolar world where there's shared power. We're living in a multi-aligned world of transactional, fluid, short-term relationships where there's increasing resort to military force and where the guardrails on the use of power are actually in retreat. That's why I talk a lot about this being an age of impunity, because what was the promise after the end of the Cold War, after 1990, was that we'd move from having organized confrontation to multilateral cooperation. And that's been lost essentially in the last 10 or 15 years. And what we face is a world of multi-alignment where there is impunity in respect of international law increasingly, and where the international institutions are completely sidelined by the political divisions that exist.
I want to move around the globe as quickly as possible, but I want you to respond, if you can, to what Clarissa was suggesting, I think, about Yemen, which is that the Houthis, having their own agenda and operating on behalf of an adversarial power, are immune or largely immune to deterrence. Do you think that America and its allies, including Britain, in a focused way, can restore a sense of consequence to this emerging axis of autocracy, however temporary and fluid it is?
Yeah, I also had the same car journey that Clarissa had in Sana'a, where you have to go to 3 cars to go and meet the Houthi leadership.
Did he feed you as well?
For a reason that I simply cannot fathom, I was not offered the lunch. I don't know what it was about Clarissa that led them to offer you the lunch. But I've sat in that meeting. A couple of things. One, I think it's very important to understand that the roots of the Houthis are not in Iran. The roots of the Houthis are in Yemen. It emerged as a domestic Yemeni political movement that was sidelined in various deals. It was domestically generated, not externally generated. In that sense, it's different from Hezbollah, which was created from abroad. Secondly, I think it's very important to recognize that post-October the 7th, the deployment of the 2 American aircraft carriers, that was an act of deterrence, because there was a real danger that on October the 8th, 9th, and 10th, there would have been a second front opened from the north of Israel by Hezbollah, and it wasn't. A very clear message was sent both to Hezbollah and to the Iranians about the consequences of that would happen. Thirdly, the original Houthi attacks on the shipping in the Red Sea were a surprise. No one was expecting them. But the deterrent capacity that was established after the first round of attacks did lead to the reductions. What's happened since then is now this attack on Tel Aviv. The attack on Hodeidah, which is the port that supplies Yemen, that's not going to deter the Houthis at all. So the direct answer to your question is deterrent possible? Yes, but only if it's aimed in the right places, at places that hurt the people in power.
Mm-hmm. So, Clarissa, when you think about so we have, and I want to get to this because it's important, we don't talk enough about, you mentioned this before, small wars, or maybe big wars that don't get attention. But when you look around the world in your job, what is the war that gets no attention that ought to get attention, not only for humanitarian reasons, but because it can quickly develop into something with global geopolitical consequences?
I mean, there are a lot. There are a lot, and we have such a tiny bandwidth because we feel so exasperated and overloaded with everything that's going on. I think if you take a look at what's happening in the Sahel, take a look at the fact that the Americans are going to be leaving Niger in a month's time.
Give 1 minute of background on that.
1 minute of background. Niger, home to a hugely important U.S. outpost that is monitoring terrorist activity using drones throughout the entire Sahel region. Coup there. The irony of this coup is that the people who carried it out were most of them trained by the U.S. military, had spent a lot of time with the U.S. military, and sure enough...
So they were good at it, is what you're saying. Yeah.
And fast forward, the sort of worst fear was that the Russians would try to exploit the situation, get involved. There was some ambiguity as to whether this would happen because, of course, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who headed the Wagner Group, had been killed, and it was unclear what the status of Russia in Africa was. Now, it's becoming clear that Russia is going to continue its operations in Africa, albeit in a slightly more centralized manner. They are sending trainers into Niger. They will literally be doing a virtual handover, though probably without saying hi and bye to each other, in this airbase. So that's just one example. Another thing that none of us talk about anymore is ISIS. I just got back from Syria, where I spent time in camps and prisons where 50,000 ISIS family members, supporters are being held with all sorts of challenges to that situation, zero human rights, zero due process, real questions around the security of some of the facilities that they are being held in. Children are being taken away from their parents when they're 10 years old, boys, so that they don't become radicalized. They're being held in other facilities. I was talking to 11-year-olds who don't know their name. This is not just a disaster on a human rights level, this is a disaster on a security level. You have American generals who are standing up and saying, we have a huge problem with this. We need to reduce the number of ISIS sympathizers in these camps by 1/2 within the next 5 years. And then you have a bunch of countries around the world that say, well, we're just not going to take them back. And for the vast majority of people who, as I said, are completely overwhelmed, they don't have the bandwidth to engage in these issues. They don't have the bandwidth to care. Understandably, one can argue about ISIS supporters, for example. And so that's just two off the top of my head. And
I mean, I completely agree with what you've just said, Clarissa, and I think it's a really important point of this panel that there are more than just two big wars in the world today. We devote so much attention to the situation in the Middle East and in Ukraine that we forget the war that you're describing. There are actually 5 wars killing around 10,000 people.
We didn't even talk about Sudan.
Sudan.
Well, we're not finished.
And let's not forget Myanmar. So there are 5 wars in the world today that are killing 10,000 people a year ongoing. And then there are another 16 wars that are killing up to 10,000. Majority of them are in Africa. Now, why? What is going on here? You know, I don't remember Steve Pinker promising this future when he published Enlightenment Now. I want to suggest that the reason that there's so much conflict, particularly in Africa, is that we came out of the interwar period between Cold War I and Cold War II, and with the beginning of Cold War II and the formation of the axis between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, the forces that made small wars, big wars in Cold War I have returned. What is going on in Africa is not unrelated to what Russia has been doing. You mentioned the Wagner Group. It had a hand in a great deal of the destabilizing that has produced conflict in multiple African states. So I think if we're trying to understand why it's such a dangerous world, I don't really agree with David's it's a fragmented world. I think it's much more that we've returned to a bipolar world with two superpowers and their allies, and then a bunch of people who want to be non-aligned. And once you have that bipolar world again, and there really are only two superpowers, the resources start to be made available that make civil wars much bigger than they were in the 1990s or the 2000s. That's how I would think about the world today.
Let me pick this up, because this is really important. There are more than 50 civil conflicts going on around the world at the moment. And Neil's absolutely right about the number of battlefield deaths, more than 10,000, more than 1,000. But let's just stop on the Sudan one, because I think it actually runs against your argument, and I'd like to hear whether you're willing to buy this. Look, Sudan is a country of about 45 million people. It's genuinely a regional superpower. It's on the Red Sea, it's in the northeast of Africa. It had a dictatorship, Omar al-Bashir, indicted by the ICC. He was ousted, a civilian rule came in. There was a military coup, and then what happened on the 23rd of April last year is that the military split in two between the Sudanese armed forces and the so-called Rapid Support Force, who are the successors to you may remember the name Janjaweed, the people who unleashed terror in Darfur 20 years ago. Now, the reason I say it's a multi-aligned world is as follows. Which side is Iran on? Iran, peculiarly, is actually supporting the Sudanese armed forces, the government. So is Egypt. Which side is Russia on? Well, Russia is actually supporting the Rapid Support Force, alongside the Emiratis. So you've got this regional explosion that is not falling into the bipolar or divided world that you've described. I just want to do 30 seconds of my day job. Of the 45 million people who live there, 19 million are in humanitarian need. That means they depend on organizations like the International Rescue Committee to feed themselves. 9 million of them have been displaced from their homes, including our head office, which had to evacuate from Khartoum down south, 3 hours south, on the day of the violence started. 1.5 million people of that 9 million have fled to neighboring countries. 600,000 people have gone to South Sudan. I promise you, if you're a refugee going to South Sudan, you must be absolutely desperate to leave the place that you're going to. Another 500,000 have gone to Chad. And there's a bigger point there. Most refugees are in poor countries, not in rich countries. The 1.5 million people who fled from Sudan, they've not ended up on the southern border, they've not ended up in Europe. They're actually in the neighboring states. So there's a humanitarian element to this that is completely prisoner to the political gridlock that exists. But I think it's a prototypical example of what makes the modern world so dangerous. Very poor governance, weak governance, deep divisions in a country, massive resource stress exacerbated by climate, because conflict and climate are exacerbating each other, and then external intervention, not by the two great Cold War powers. It's not America and China who are supporting each side. It's the middle powers that are delivering arms and ammunition and sometimes personnel to the feuding elements.
Clarissa, can I try a question out on you? I'm not sure I know the answer to this, but I think we have to ask it. If one looks at the places where really large numbers of people have been displaced, where the refugee populations are in the millions, it's interesting to me that they are places that the US either did not intervene in, Syria, or pulled out of, Afghanistan. And I wonder if over the time of your career, we seem to have moved from a period when it seemed as if the problem arose from American intervention. Iraq being the obvious case, to a period in which the problem is now that the United States really does not want to intervene. And we haven't even talked about places where the US plays up almost no role, like Myanmar. A lot of the problems that we're talking about here reflect a retreat by the United States from hegemonic power and the growth of the influence of China, of Russia, of Iran. They don't all, of course, act in concert, because the axis of ill will is full of mutual suspicion, just as the original axis was back in the 1930s. But it's the fact that these authoritarian powers are exercising much more power around the world, and the United States is in a not politically just supplying weapons to Ukraine. It's not even as if the US is intervening in Ukraine, just supplies weapons. So I feel as if the US role has completely changed in 20 years.
Well, I just would put it a different way, because I think that America had this fantasy. If we do nothing, if we learn our lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan, if we just withdraw and try to deal with our own stuff, that's great. No one can get upset with us, right? Turns out, inaction is an action as well. Yeah. Inaction has consequences as well. And that's not to say one way or the other, that inaction is a good thing or a bad thing. It's just to say that it's a fantasy to believe that when you don't act and you don't get involved, that you get to wipe your hands of it and walk away. And I think the other thing I want to say, because we're having this conversation and it's very staccato and everyone's very clever and talking very quickly about very important issues, and it's wonderful. But
I was talking quite slowly.
When I was in Syria and Bashar al-Assad was killing people, and I was at a funeral of a 16-year-old boy, and I was walking through a graveyard that they had set up for all the people who had been killed by Bashar al-Assad's forces. And I had my little camera. I was alone. I was posing as a tourist. I managed to get a visa. I had my little camera, and I was filming in this graveyard. And this Syrian man came up to me, and he said, "These are real bodies. These are not toys. These are not stones. These are real bodies." And it was a moment that really stopped me in my tracks, because in a way, he was almost chastising me to say, that's fine, you're doing your job, but don't forget these are real people. They had loved ones, they had dreams. And I think so often when we are having these conversations, we're so fixated on the journalist's duty to inform that we forget the journalist's duty is also to humanize, to make real what is unreal or surreal. You know, you're talking about those refugee camps. I went to a refugee camp in Somalia, and the woman, the first thing she said to me, she was kind of the local who had been there a long time and knew the lay of the land very well. And she said, "Do you want to see the baby graveyard?" I said, "What do you mean?" "Oh, we have an area where we bury the babies." And so I just think occasionally when we're thinking about the impact of foreign policy and U.S. foreign policy and America's role in the world, it behooves us to remember that these are not stones. These are not toys.
Absolutely. Well, that's absolutely true, but they're not two discrete baskets. In other words, Barack Obama's decision not to enforce the red line after the use of chemical weapons by Bashar al-Assad that led to the deaths of, among other people, children, that had enormous...
That's what I mean. Inaction can have...
No, it's interesting, because there's a much deeper conversation here about the humanization that you're talking about, and that is necessary. I just remember, I mean, it's sort of a formative experience in my 1994 in Rwanda, being with a small group of journalists, watching a long line of Hutu refugees, the Tutsis, the Rwandan patriot, the Kagame forces had come in and swept into Kigali, and the Hutus are running away into the Congo. And long lines, bedraggled, terrible. I mean, the kind of people that you serve in your organization. And a lot of the journalists with me were like, "Oh my God, look at the terrible plight of these people." These were the people who were committing genocide a week before, who just happened to lose and were running away. It doesn't mean that they don't need to be fed, don't need to be housed, clothed, etc. But what I was noticing in the way some of my colleagues were dealing with them was that the emotion created by the superficial view was distorting their understanding of the politics and the consequences of political action. I don't know if we could ever solve the problem of balancing the cold geopolitics versus the awful human toll.
Well, you have both.
But you do, but it's very hard to sort of find them in balance. You were going to say.
Well, this is the problem. We didn't want to recognize that non-intervention after the red line was crossed in Syria ultimately had worse consequences than the intervention in Iraq in 2003. The death toll in the Syrian civil war now exceeds considerably the death toll that arose.
Well, that's
from the
assuming
US
that our
Iraq.
intervention
And it's
by
very,
Obama would stop that war. That wouldn't have stopped the war.
But Obama's
talking more
failure
about
to enforce
Putin's
the
red
red line
lines,
was even more disastrous because it let the Russians in. I mean, remember, he handed off the question of chemical weapons to Putin. And that was the opening of the door to Russia to become a player in the Middle East, a door that had been closed in the face of the Russians back in the mid-1970s. So I don't think we fully reckoned with the foreign policy errors of the Obama administration, because at the time it was very hard to criticize him. I remember well being pilloried for criticizing the first Obama term. I think the second Obama term was worse. And many of the mistakes that were made then, for example, in 2014 over Ukraine, were then repeated by the Biden administration. And we can't have a good conversation about this, because the minute you say anything critical, you're immediately pigeonholed as a Trump supporter. I mean, I am not a Trump supporter, but I am trying to convince you that the Democrats have not had a particularly storied career with foreign policy in our time.
I want to just jumping onto that. I want to ask you. We're talking about finding a Goldilocks solution to our role in the world, and maybe there is nothing that's not too hot, not too cold. But from your perspective, what was a period in which America was more or less getting it right? In other words, enforcing the rules of international law, keeping the sea lanes open, supporting Democrats abroad, democratic governments abroad. What was a good period?
I think that you've got to recognize that if you're looking for a period when it's all been good, you're going to fail. Within any period, you can find some things that have been done well and some things that have not been done well. Look, let's be honest. This country has a very difficult relationship with the idea of international agreements, even those that it agrees with. So you mentioned shipping lanes. So the US actually supports the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but because of the fear of foreign entanglements that goes back 250 years, you won't sign the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And that means that when the Chinese break the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and you complain about it, they just say, well, you're not signatories to that anyway. But you can pick different...
The idea that everything would be fine if the US played along with all the international agreements, I think, is a tad naive. Well, that is not the issue. The answer to your question, Jeffrey, is there is a period when the United States nailed it. And that period is from...
I'll get your time back. Don't worry. We'll get your time back. Go on.
There are many
But there's a simple answer to the question. From the moment that the United States entered World War II until the disastrous escalation in Vietnam by Lyndon Johnson, the United States was the decisive force for freedom in the world. That's a long period of success, and I think since Vietnam, the United States has had much more difficulty in consistently exercising power. It's veered back and forth as within the parties between a kind of idealism that then leads to Syria, and then an excessive use of force, which produced the
there are many things. There are many things I miss about the House of Commons, obviously, and it's nice to feel back that I'm in the House of Commons.
Are you going to go back? You need to go back.
Neil intervening on me. Usually, you actually have to give way for someone to come in and interrupt. They can't just do it off their own.
We're in the Wild West here, by the way. We're not in the House of Commons, all right?
I will yield to no one in defending the aggregate levels of peace and prosperity that were established after 1945. But I will also not yield to anyone in saying that everything went well from the Bay of Pigs onwards in that period. So let's not kid ourselves that there are periods when in aggregate things are going well, but there are also things going wrong. I just want to come back to a point that Clarissa was making, because I think it goes even deeper. The dehumanization that you spoke of, in part reflects, and I'll misquote you a little. You said something like, "It's just there's too much going on. We haven't got the bandwidth to deal with it." And Stalin said, one person's death is a tragedy, a million people's death is a statistic. We're suffering from that in spades. But I want to try and venture something more difficult, more controversial in this space, because the dehumanization that I see in my work, it's of a slightly different kind. And it's a dehumanization that I would group under a chilling phrase that I saw. And the phrase is the tribalization of pain. And the tribalization of pain is the idea that if it's your own group that is suffering, you care. And if it's another group, another ethnicity, another religion, another race, you don't care.
Hasn't it always been thus?
Oh, no, it hasn't been, because it's the antithesis of the best of the American vision of the liberal international order. The liberal international order was not liberal in the sense of being left-wing, not right-wing. The word liberal in liberal international order is a reference to the idea that for the first time in human history after 1945, the rights of individuals were instantiated in international law. For the previous 300 or 400 years since 1648, Treaty of Westphalia, states had rights, but individuals had no rights. Since 1945, UN Declaration on Human Rights, UN Rights on Convention of Refugees, UN Rights for International Rights for Children. There was this idea that human rights sit alongside states' rights. And so it's not right to say, it would be wrong to say there was a period when they were fully honored. They weren't. But let's not lose sight of the extraordinary universalist human ambition that underpins that. The tribalization of pain under the most excruciating circumstances. That's why what the Rabbi Bruce said here yesterday was so extraordinary. She said, look, I sat in Jerusalem with people who are with hostage families, and I went across the road and I sat with a Palestinian who had an Excel spreadsheet of 150 family members who'd been killed in Gaza. And she said, we've got to be able to care about both. And that argument against the tribalization of pain, I think, is incredibly important.
It's a good point. Thank you for saying that. We're going to try to do one or two questions, if we can, in one moment. But I want to just ask Clarissa, people, Americans especially, want to know how wars end. Maybe you could give us an insight about Ukraine and possibly Gaza as well in 12 seconds. No, this came up in a couple of different conversations here, especially about Ukraine. Obviously, Donald Trump has said, I become president,
Right.
24 hours, we have peace. What he means is, presumably, that he'll tell Zelensky, agree to the severing of parts of your country, or I won't give you any more weapons. But that doesn't sound like, that's a desert that they can call peace. But tell us what your view.
So I would say usually wars end, with a whimper and not a bang. And I think that Ukraine is probably not very different in that sense. I think that there is huge anxiety, understandably, within Ukraine about what a Trump presidency would mean for the end of this war. What a deal that Donald Trump has talked about would look like. The only thing that's interesting that I would say has shifted a little bit, because during the last 2 years, President Zelensky has understood that he does not have a mandate to even sit down at a negotiating table and have a conversation about a settlement, right? It's just not acceptable.
That's radioactive.
It's radioactive. He can't do it. However, there has been some polling done recently in Ukraine in which Ukrainians have said for the first time that potentially they would accept saying goodbye to parts of Donbass if there was some guarantee made about their security. So what's interesting about that is, first of all, I think many Ukrainians have actually felt that for quite some time and maybe haven't felt brave enough or beleaguered enough to articulate it. But it definitely creates an opening, not necessarily for Trump, but for anyone potentially, to look into whether there could be some kind of a security agreement, either unilaterally, bilaterally with the U.S., or some kind of a NATO, some kind of an insurance of Ukraine's airspace and broader security in return for basically saying goodbye to parts of Donbass. I think the more realistic outcome in Ukraine is something more akin to what we see or saw in Korea, which is a war of attrition followed by a frozen front line with so many dead and no real meaningful momentum forwards in terms of trying to figure out a way out of this. On Gaza, forget 12 seconds, I don't think there is a single person on earth right now who has a really coherent and credible plan. And I have heard so many different thoughts and ideas from different people. A very senior UAE diplomat recently came out and said that the UAE would be happy to be part of some kind of an international peacekeeping force in Gaza. The Israelis have said they don't want to occupy Gaza, but on the other hand, they don't want to do anything that would allow for any other kind of status quo to exist. So Gaza is a giant festering wound. It is a massive stain on our collective human consciousness. And the worst case scenario of Mogadishu on the Med that had been sort of bandied about by UN officials and some in the Israeli military is already happening.
Neil, very quickly, because we want to...
Let me just jump in, because I want to pass a genuine question to Neil. Everyone has a Ukraine policy. No one has a Russia policy. My first job in 2007 when I became foreign minister was to decide what to do about the Russian refusal to cooperate in the prosecution of those who had murdered Mr. Litvinenko in Britain, a dual citizen. And we expelled Russian diplomats more than ever before. They expelled our diplomats. It went back to business as usual. Russia's ability to project power in so many malign ways goes way beyond what anything I would have thought 15, 20 years ago. And I think the question, if you're a Ukrainian, but frankly, if you're a European or an American, is less about where the dividing line is in Ukraine. It's much more about what is the constraining or containing or deterring that you're going to do of the Russian machine, which is a state machine and a non-state machine. It's an oligarch's machine as well as a bureaucrat's machine. And I really think this is where there's a massive vacuum, because it's a Russia policy that we need much more than a Ukraine policy.
Neil, very quickly.
Well, I want to go to the audience. I'll be really quick. I think Clarissa is right. I think this war will have to end with not a peace but an armistice next year, because it's very hard for both sides to continue at this intensity. It will only produce a stable armistice if the United States exerts pressure on Russia. The challenge for Russia, David, is how do you convert the last of the empires? Because really Russia is the last of the European empires. It's a colonial army that is waging this war. How do you convert it into a normal nation state, as all the other European empires have achieved? And that is going to be really hard as long as Putin is there. But let's be, for a moment, optimistic before we go to the audience. It's not that Putin has forever. Putin is mortal. So is Xi Jinping. So is Khamenei, and they don't have a succession plan. Not one of these regimes has a succession plan. And that's the one thing that gives me optimism at this point. I think the war can be not ended in the sense of a peace, but stopped. And I think that will happen next year. But I think it only will come from an American application of pressure. That's what I think is important about the shift away from isolationism that you're seeing in the Republican Party right now. Let's go to the audience.
Yes, let's go to the audience. Do you want to...
I think you and I should do something on this.
I don't know about you all. I'm feeling very optimistic. Seriously, great discussion.
Ask questions in the form of a question.
All
That's
right.
the only thing.
Nice, tight, short questions. Just got a few minutes up here. Thank you. Just off the right aisle.
Thanks very much. I wonder about China. You've talked a little bit around China, but you didn't really talk about US-China relations and the
That's
dangers
in our third
there.
hour to come back.
Well, this is the most important relationship in the world. As I said, there are two superpowers in terms of economics, in terms of technology. There are only two superpowers in AI, only two superpowers in quantum computing. And the thing that would be far scarier than anything we've talked about in the past 55 minutes is a showdown between the United States and China over Taiwan. I talked about this briefly yesterday in the Kissinger session. We're much closer to such a showdown than most people realize. Bill Burns said twice, including I think here, or it may have been at the A place last year,
Abilene.
Xi Jinping, in his view, had told the Chinese military to be ready for war by 2027. Whoever is president in the next administration is going to have to deal with the Taiwan crisis. And if that crisis happens, it will be like the Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse, the most dangerous moment of our lifetimes.
And this is why deterrence is by far and away the most important issue we're faced. Because that's the big enchilada.
And that's what has worried me consistently, because we've stopped using the language of strategic ambiguity. In fact, we've become more aggressive in our Taiwanese rhetoric under Joe Biden, without actually having the wherewithal to deter the Chinese from doing the blockade, which I think is what they're planning.
By the way, there is discussion about shifting the entire focus of the Marine Corps of the United States toward that strait, essentially. That's going to be an entirely Pacific force in order to do one thing, convince the Chinese that it's not worth trying to seize Taiwan. Sorry.
Great. Is there, over there on the left? Thanks.
Thank you very much. My question is for Mr. Ferguson. Using your verbiage from yesterday, who do you see as having a sense of the chessboard and the player if we've identified some of these failures on foreign policy? And is there anyone doing it well or able to see, is there a reason why perhaps a withdrawal from Afghanistan would have gone better under a Trump administration like he intended to do?
Well, we can't know that. Of course, he claims it. That's easy to do. I think what's attractive about the United States is the way in which people set out their foreign policy wares in magazines like yours, Jeffrey, or in Foreign Affairs. And if you read those magazines, there have been, I think, some quite interesting essays recently. Matt Pottinger and Mike Gallagher did a very hawkish essay for Foreign Affairs, which essentially said, we've got to be ready to push China all the way to regime change. And Robert O'Brien, who was National Security Advisor under Trump, one of the many, wrote a very good piece, which I thought was reassuring. I mean, as I said, I have all kinds of mixed feelings about Donald Trump, have done all along. But the quality of people is the key. Foreign policy is not something that the president just makes up as king. The foreign policy comes from the national security team. And one of the striking things to me is the way you can begin to see who's likely making the calls if Trump wins. And people like O'Brien are impressive. If Mike Pompeo comes in, I'd be nervous because he's become so hawkish on Taiwan. He's basically advocating Taiwanese independence, which seems to me an incredibly risky thing. But the key, if you really care about these issues, is read what the candidates for high office are writing. And after all, if you'd wanted to know what Kissinger was likely to do in 1969, reading what he'd written in the previous 2 decades was not a bad way to think it through.
I just have to say, because I spent a lot of time writing about all of Trump's men, that it's somewhat optimistic to think that the quality of hires he's going to make in the second term is going to equal the Jim Mattises and the Rex Tillerson.
Well, actually, I mean, that was a good laugh line, but...
No, it's a serious, very serious point.
In truth, I think you're underestimating the problems that arose for Trump in having an essentially establishment team, including people like Jim Mattis, who in no way agreed with Trump. This will be very different in the sense that I think the people who will get the key positions will be more aligned. And if you read carefully, as I said you should do, read carefully Trump's interview with Bloomberg Businessweek. There is a theory here. It's interesting that he compares himself explicitly to McKinley, of all people, argues that tariffs are part of a new return to what I think of as a 19th century American foreign policy, sees very clearly the way in which the United States has suffered economically from the currency manipulation of China, and then argues quite explicitly for a realist strategy, not isolationist. The really important point I want to convey to you is that isolationism is no longer on the menu in the way that it was, say, a year or so ago when the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene were getting the headlines. And this is important. So, I'm not asking you to love Trump. I'm asking you to prepare, because the probability is still quite high that he is the next president of the United States. And you need to deal with that reality, and hissing is just the sound of your balloon deflating.
Let David go.
Do you want to have a word?
Sorry to say it.
It's nice to end on a harmonious note.
Yeah.
I just want to say that in my experience, we really underestimate how important the man or woman at the top actually is. in every political system, a democratic system or a dictatorial system, in the end, you do need to take seriously and literally what the person at the top thinks. And in all the systems, you can argue about the players, but actually the fact that you come back to the Bloomberg interview in the end proves the point. It's not about the second and third and fourth tier. The accumulated experience, sometimes wisdom, of 50, 60, 70, 80-year-olds who are in office, in the end, they got there because they think they're right about things, and it will be, in the end, they who take the biggest and toughest decisions. So all of the Kremlinology will not substitute for what actually the person at the top thinks.
Thank you very much, all of you. You said you wanted a real conversation. That's a real conversation. Thank you all.
I didn't even hear what you said.